Welcome to Breaking Convention.
My name is Neal Goldsmith. I'm a psychologist in New York. I have a practice, a clinical practice, and I do that about a third of my time. And then I do public speaking and writing another third, and then another third I'm at home with my 12-year-old son. And so it's a really lovely life to have, and it gives me an occasion to be here as well. But I'm going to talk a lot about my psychotherapy practice. I'm going to cover the history of psychedelics, yes, but briefly, because probably you're pretty familiar with the broad strokes of the history, and also because we're now at a point in our development of psychotherapy where we're really being influenced by psychedelics, where psychedelics bring us. I think we're in a position now where we're coming full circle. I'm going to the concept of psychotherapy, psychedelics, and change. Is change even really the proper object or proper goal for psychotherapy? Isn't really acceptance and surrender and release more a healthier sign of adjustment and maturity? And if so, it's remarkably similar to the places we go to in psychedelics, where surrender and release and acceptance are the keys. And I think that in those two areas, in psychotherapy and psychedelics, the reason why those things are similar is because in both cases the goal is to get down to the soul. And soul is a dirty word in psychiatry and psychology, but should not be. And I'll talk a little bit about how the psyche or the soul is really the core concept in both the psychedelic experience, I believe, and also in psychotherapy. And I'm going to ask these questions. I have a book, Psychedelic Healing, that just came out in January, and I'm going to cleave fairly close to the topics in the book. In fact, at a certain point, there's going to be 30 themes from the book, really 30 themes from my practice that I'll put on the screen, and you'll have a chance to read them quickly. I hope you can read them. It's a big screen. And see which ones grab you, and you'll ask, well, what about number 17? And we'll talk a little bit about that. That's sort of in lieu of, instead of having an open Q&A at the end. So I'm going to do that in the sort of about a third talking about the history and about a third talking about those issues that I think are quite deep. And then I'll come back and try to close things up with some ideas about the future of psychedelics and the conclusions and implications that I think we're ready as a society to draw. So just a bit on the Western research tradition. These are the broad strokes I referred to earlier. It really begins in a way with the extraction or separation of mescaline from peyote, which happened in the late 19th century. It continued really a traditional research tradition. You know, people distinguish between the South and the West, if you will, between the tribal tradition and the Western laboratory type tradition. But the tribal tradition is also research. It's just instead of taking place simultaneously with several conditions in a control, it takes place chronologically, where people try something for 100 years and it becomes part of the ritual and the lore, and try something else for another 100 years. And over the time, over a period of centuries, you have a really nice research tradition of knowledge that's instantiated in ritual. Because ritual, far from being superstitious or religious, is really the instantiation or the holding of what works, what's safe and what's effective. And in the US, the Federal Drug Administration has those as their basic 2 criteria for scheduling a drug, for approving drugs: safety and efficacy. And in the tribal tradition, it's the same thing, of course. You know, how can we achieve the condition that we're looking to achieve and do it safely? And so ritual instantiates that. And in our Western tradition, the methodologies that we use in laboratories and the guidelines in clinical practice are really rituals, maybe shorn of some of the superstition, but maybe not. Hans Kluver tried to quantify the mescaline experience, the visual patterns that we see. Richard Evans Schultes, until his death, the emeritus director of the Harvard Botanical Library, and the original Indiana Jones, going down to the Amazon and began to bring back a rich research tradition, a rich tribal tradition. Of course, many of you are familiar with Albert Hofmann's bicycle ride, Albert Hofmann being the discoverer of LSD. You know, he wrote a book called LSD, My Problem Child, because, of course, you know, his dearest hope was that the use of LSD would become an aid to meditation and not a problem child at all. Abe Hoffer and Humphrey Osmond were perhaps the first to look at the clinical uses of LSD up in Saskatchewan, where they tried to treat alcoholism, and with some great success as well. And with Aldous Huxley coined the term psychedelic. There was a bit of a debate at that point between Huxley and Zahner, who's a religious scholar, who took a mild and unsuccessful dose of mescaline and thereafter denounced it. And Huxley and Zahner had a bit of a debate on that. The question of whether the doors of perception, Huxley's famous book, whether psychedelics are actually a door that you can actually walk through, or whether they're just simply a window that you can see through and really not go to and live in. Because really, to make maximum benefit of psychedelics, I believe, it requires not just the explosive, episodic, you know, occasional, huge insights that we frequently will forget after a while as we get back to our day-to-day life, which is less compatible with that state. But a second practice, which would be something daily, like meditation in particular, which would help you give root to the insights that you get through psychedelics. Gordon Wasson was a banker and a mycophile, a lover of mushrooms, who heard about the sacred mushroom tradition in Mexico and was the first Anglo to experience the Veleda, the mushroom ceremony, which had been driven almost to extinction by the Spanish colonization of Mexico. He wrote a very influential article in 1959, I believe it was, in Life magazine about his experiences with all sorts of wonderful photographs. And one of the people who read that article was Timothy Leary, and he had his own mushroom experience and began his quest to introduce psychedelics to Western society in a very wholehearted way. And before he began working with LSD, Leary was working with psilocybin, the active ingredient in mushrooms, and had 3 wonderful studies. The Massachusetts Correctional Institution study, where he looked at the influence of this psychedelic experience on recidivism, positive results, but tainted a bit methodologically by extra tender loving care, we call it, extra attention by nurses and doctors to the experimental subjects, the prisoners who were given psychedelics, and less special attention to those who were not. There was also some fudge data. Rick Doblin has did a 20-year follow-up on that study and found some fudge data. But again, the sort of implication, the promise of psychedelics for things like recidivism, for things like alcoholism, for marriage and family therapy, for so many different application areas, which I'll go to in the next slide, are really about transformation, about releasing, seeing clearly how your personality formed, seeing clearly society and yourself as a match, as a fit for society, unfortunately, in many cases, and then coming clear and saying, oh my God, I've wasted my life, I've been drinking, or oh my God, I've wasted my life, I'm on my deathbed, bring my estranged relatives close. Oh my God, in terms of meditation, it's oh my God, period. The Remarkable People study, where they had a lovely house outside of, in Cambridge, near Harvard, where they invited artists and jazz musicians and philosophers and religious studies scholars to come in and experience psilocybin. And it was anecdotal and wonderful and formed this sort of prior database for what later became more laboratory research. And the Good Friday experiment, the miracle at Marsh Chapel, where divinity students, 20 of them, half were given psilocybin and half were not. And after about an hour, everybody knew who was the experimental subjects and who were the controls. There was another follow-up by Rick Doblin from MAPS. You're all familiar with MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies.org. At maps.org. I encourage you to go take a look at it. It's really the best game in town for reviews of the research and of the policy issues. It's not, well, I got so high last weekend. It's not one of those listservs, but it's a place where you can really understand what's happening in all the research. And the research folks who are presenting here this weekend are all listed there, and you can get more information. So maps.org, and it's a $35 membership, I think. So I really encourage you guys to just to bite the bullet and become members. You'll get a wonderful bulletin, a scholarly bulletin, I think 2 or 3 times a year for your money, as well as the good feeling of having contributed to the research. Sasha Shulgin, a psychopharmacologist in the old tradition of trying drugs on himself as legal, newly created drugs, titrating, taking small doses and increasing to the point where you feel something, and then bringing his team of scholars and scientists to test the new drugs and to write a report on it. And his books, PCOL and TCOL, are results of that, that wonderful 20-year period when he was doing that. Of course, here in Europe, there's, and I don't want to, excuse me while I refer to my notes for a second. This spectacular research tradition that we in the States often overlook, I must apologize for, but in addition to Jan Bastiaans and Hans Carl Luhner and Ronald Sanderson here in the UK, later on Peter Baumann and Maxine, Marianne Bloch, Peter Gasser, Uri Stick, Samuel Wiedner, all from the Swiss Medical Society for Psycholytic Psychotherapy. We did wonderful work that 10 years or so ago. And Michael Schlichting, from the European College for Consciousness Studies, and many others, many of whom are here, Ben Sessa and others, who really deserve recognition as well. And of course, the changing research climate. In 1992, I want to say, the US government decided to open up the practice of doing this research again and consider psychedelics just like any other new investigational research drug. Of course, there'd been a 30-year history by then of good research, but much of it methodologically flawed. Like, for example, the prisoner study. That would never get approved nowadays because prisoners can't give informed consent. There's always the promise that they might get out for good behavior. So a little bit about the history there, and it's widely available online. So I encourage you to educate yourself as to the fact. When I talk to people about psychedelics in my life, they frequently, they don't realize that there was a research tradition. In fact, I, as a psychology student, never was instructed about the psychedelic research that was out there. There were 10,000 peer-reviewed papers by the time the research was shut down. So there's a rich research tradition. I encourage you to become familiar with it. Application areas, creativity. These are sort of going from, in a way, more common or more integrated into your life to the more transcendent. Creativity research tradition, relationship counseling using MDMA. When MDMA or ecstasy was scheduled in the US, the Congress was inundated with letters and protests by couples therapists and family therapists who said, you can't do this. This is our primary tool. Criminal recidivism with a question mark, as I indicated earlier. Substance abuse and addiction. The asterisks indicate work that's going on nowadays. That's current research as well. Work with depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. Michael Mithofer and his wife Anne, who are doing this wonderful work using MDMA with post-traumatic stress disorder, which really has no effective treatment. And the MDMA work is striking, very, very effective. Childhood autism. Using psychedelics with children is, of course, controversial. However, in the research tradition, in a professional setting, if the data support it, from my perspective, any help for anyone is appropriate. Pain relief. Why do psychedelics give pain relief? There was a researcher at the University of Chicago who gave LSD to cancer patients, and their pain was relieved for 10 days. Now, no analgesic, no pain relief medication works for 10 days. So what was the explanation? Well, he described it as the attenuation of anticipation of their death. The fear was gone. Because again, it's like I said, oh my God, I've wasted my life. Well, this is, oh my God, I understand that there's something more to me, or I believe I've come in touch with a broader spiritual reality, and I'm not so scared of death. And therefore, because pain, physical pain, is more socially acceptable than existential pain, I don't have to displace my fear of death into a physical symptom anymore. And so for 10 days, their physical pain was reduced. End-of-life anxiety, Roland will talk about that. The facilitation of the meditative state. There's been some research in that area as well, using low doses, generally speaking, often MDMA. And of course, the elicitation of the mystical experience, which Roland will talk about as well. The three in detail I'm going to pass over, but they are substance abuse and addiction. I have copies of my slides for anybody who would like them. You can contact me here, or just email to my name, Neal, N-E-A-L, @inch.com, and I will be happy to send you the slides. The second one is the end-of-life anxiety topic. Eric Kast was the researcher at the University of Chicago who achieved pain relief with his subjects. And then the meditative and spiritual development issue. These 10 lessons are briefly simply the rediscovery of tribal knowledge, that we've reinvented the wheel in the West. And so every bit of methodological guidance, that, the story goes that we would strap people down to gurneys in psychiatric facilities and inject them with large doses of LSD. And then, of course, when they were uncomfortable, we would label the psychedelic experience the psychotomimetic experience, mimicking psychosis. But in reality, of course, we've learned how to do psychedelic therapy in a supportive setting. Well, that's something that, of course, the tribal tradition already knows. And in each case, the methodologies that we've evolved over the last 60 years or so in the West are, in essence, rediscoveries of knowledge that already exists in tribal societies. And we should probably make that a more systematic effort of mining the tribal tradition for insights and tools that we can use, methodologies that we can apply, translating them into our modern context, without, of course, doing a sort of extractive approach, which is so often used when West meets South. Methodological issues remain. The issue of double blind. It's very important to have a double-blind randomized and control group design, but as I mentioned, the control groups, Ben talked about it as being the gold standard for our research, and he's right, of course. However, with psychedelics, it's difficult. So we do it anyway, but we need to just explore that issue a little further. Why do psychedelics provide pain relief, as I discussed? Is psychedelic spirituality real? That was the Zahner-Huxley debate. Is it ersatz mysticism or just nature mysticism? So that debate continues. I think people who are in two sides of that debate, those who have had a psychedelic mystical experience and those who have not. What about lasting change? How long does it last? We don't ask penicillin to work with just one pill, nor do we ask insulin to work just for 30 days. So perhaps this leads us to the concept of booster shots for psychedelic work. Excuse me. So if the data show that people in alcoholic research, for example, are cured of their alcoholism after 6 months, but after 2 years are drinking again, well, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that perhaps we should give them psychedelics again before 2 years come up. So the idea of giving booster shots is not really discussed that much, or not part of the protocols, but perhaps it should be. Do we take a Western scientific approach as medicine, or a different approach, a more spiritual approach to psychedelics, as sacrament? And whenever I see an either or, like that one, I always think, of course, that neither of the two sides of the debate are going to win. It's not going to be a medical approach purely, and it's not going to be a spiritual approach purely disembodied from the physical world. In reality, I believe we as a society are moving toward an integration of those two opposites, healing of Cartesian duality, recognizing, as the tribal folks recognized, that we're really just one embodied spirit, that all is spiritual, that every physical object is filled with energy. And we call it energy, but you could just as easily call it love. So the distinction between mind and body, or between the affairs of man and the affairs of God, or the difference between a Western medical approach and a sacramental approach, are rapidly fading. Because when the operative healing effect is a spiritual experience, and the research shows pretty clearly that when those people who have a peak spiritual experience are more likely to have the experimental effect, be cured of alcoholism or lose their fear of dying, or whatever we're looking at. If that's the variable, it's not just the taking of a medicine like penicillin, it's the engendering of a spiritual experience which may or may not occur once you've taken that pill. And if the correlation is strong, that those who've had a spiritual experience are healed and those who haven't aren't, then how does that change the role of being a doctor, of being a psychiatrist, of science, of our whole worldview? And to me, this is a reintegration. Coming full circle, I'm saying, here is our tribal setting, here is 180 degrees away our Western approach, and then here is a reintegration. Ben, that's 10 minutes out of 30? Or 20?
10 minutes left.
Out of 30? I can't believe it.
You've had 20.
I've had 20, okay. Let me move a little quicker then.
So you can either stop and have questions or just not have questions.
I'm going to do questions right now, actually. So let me move on from these questions. Again, you can come at me with the request for slides at any point. So for me, I want to take psychology and bring it back to the study of the soul. Because for me, again, in my clinical practice, it's when people get in touch with who they really are, who they were originally when born, that really, that's the criteria for a successful clinical outcome. When they see how their personality formed in interaction with their parents usually, and how it was a defense mechanism that was necessary and beautiful as an infant, but not appropriate as an adult. Personality, of course, is a strategy devised by a 2-year-old. So, of course, it wouldn't be appropriate for the adult life. So for me, I use the word psychology, although it's a little awkward to say, as a way of reminding people that psychology is not only a clinical quantitative laboratory science, but it really, in clinical work, is really a spiritual experience, a spiritual process. And I spell spirituality with a small s to indicate that it's not supernatural. Okay, 30 themes from psychedelic healing. This will be a Q&A for us, okay? And so anything I've discussed, you're welcome to ask about. And I've got 16 themes right there. Read quickly. And I'm going to switch to the next slide as well, once I've given you a chance to take a quick look at these guys. And I hope they're legible. And then that's the rest of the 30. 17 through 30. So you're not obliged to ask every single question, but if anything there on this page or the prior one, which I'll flip back to again, grabs you and you'd like to discuss it, please raise your hand. Sir?
About halfway down, why does psychedelic research require self-experimentation? And because of this need, how will we train a new generation of psychedelic researchers and therapists?
Good. Well, the humorous way of putting it is when you use laboratory animals and you give them a psychedelic and they stare at the wall for 8 hours, you're really not sure what's going on. Likewise, when you're a person like Sasha Shulgin and you're a psychopharmacologist developing novel psychedelics that have never been tried with anyone, then you use a titration method where you try a little bit on your own. That's the traditional way of doing it. It's not considered scientifically pure these days, and in many cases it's not even allowed. So I think psychedelics research in particular requires that kind of an approach. And of course then the implications are, how do we train psychedelic therapists and researchers who may not have had a psychedelic in their experience? I think many of the young psychiatrists who are interested in psychedelics, many of them, but not most, have had their own experiences with psychedelics and are interested in pursuing it in a professional context. But not everybody, and so isn't it really important, wouldn't it be better to have all the therapists who are working with psychedelics, and the researchers for that matter, have a psychedelic experience, not on the sly, when they were a kid, but in a formal professional way as part of their training? Other questions? Sir? you speak up?
Sorry, Hoffer and Osmond's work was predicated on the use of ibogaine to cure addiction, and I believe that was
Hoffer and Osmond, you say?
yeah. I can't remember the guy's name unfortunately, but there was somebody in the early 50s was introduced to ibogaine by Bitwy, and they were informed about that. It cured him of his heroin addiction, and I think that's what their work was predicated on.
Well, that may be so to my...
The cross-fertilization between shamanic knowledge and Western laboratory knowledge has been going on forever, and it will continue to go on. That's how we train modern psychology.
I will go home and search that on the internet. My understanding was that it was mescaline, and that Howard Lotsof, yeah.
Was it later?
It was a little bit later, but I don't think Lotsof was connected to Hoffer and Osmond. But I could be wrong. But Howard Lotsof was a heroin addict who was cured of his addiction like a switch, an on-off switch, and forever maintained. And the research is supporting to some extent that there's a chemical or a biochemical switch in the brain that goes off, and that cures people of addiction, which is a different model than the one I've been talking about where you, oh my God. That one doesn't require the oh my God experience. And so it'd be, the point is more research, please. We need to specify how all these drugs work and how they work neurologically and experientially. And so we've got so much more to do. We've discovered so much and we've worked so well, but yet, we've got a lot, we're just in our infancy. Sir?
How regulated should the use of psychedelics become?
Well, okay, let's talk about that. Should it be next to the aspirin in the pharmacy? I don't think so, personally. Some people feel very strongly that drugs of all sorts should not be regulated, and it should be a matter of personal use. I believe that too as an ultimate solution, but I do believe in education. I think that there's also a need for some sort of safety concern from society, at least in terms of educating the user. So for example, there's all sorts of dangerous things that we do in society, like for example, driving a car, or skydiving, or scuba diving, or first aid rescue, all sorts of things that we do that are regulated to some extent. You need a driver's license, for example. And for me, psychedelics are the biggest contraindication, other than a family history of psychosis for the use of psychedelics, is immaturity and ignorance. So it's not regulation in the form of you may or you may not so much as it is in the form of do you really know what you're doing? And it's another question as to who determines what body of knowledge is required and who decides if you know what you're doing or not. But I personally feel that it would be helpful to have education. And if not regulated, if you want an unregulated society with the use of psychedelics, then give me 20 years of education in the schools so people know what they're doing. And then we can have an unregulated world. That's my personal opinion. I know it's other people may disagree. Other questions? Sir?
Has any thought towards any negative unintended consequences of successful psychedelic therapy?
Such as, if it's successful, what would be the negative?
Perhaps using a tool that can treat post-traumatic stress disorder, the availability of that, how would that change how the military expose troops to trauma?
Right.
Would it make them think we can mend it, we can fix it?
That's a really great question, of course. And
Maybe steer the work to catch that at the first sight of it.
it's a great question. And it also relates to another question is, as we do all this research that I've been talking about, where we specify the structure-activity relationships of chemicals in receptor sites and all the various, the spectrum of behavioral responses, as we gain that knowledge, especially the chemical knowledge, it becomes so much easier to control the population in a dystopian Brave New World sort of a way. So my hope is that as the knowledge and the research progresses, our sophistication and spiritual development progresses, not just because it develops on its own, but because of the effect of psychedelics. So that psychedelics both require a change in society in order to be adopted, but also facilitate a change in society as well. So that's my hope. But it's a very good question, and I'm glad you've asked it, because we need to continue asking that as we go along. Miss?
Psychedelics induce real spirituality. Are they a medicine or
Right. Well, I mean, spirituality is such a loaded term. I said I like to spell it with a small s, because I think of it as a natural function, as natural as breathing or going to the bathroom. It's part of your body. And so I don't really make that distinction. And so the either or questions for me are usually answered with a yes. So, are they, do they induce real spirituality? I think there's a spectrum of spiritual experiences, from nature mysticism and a sort of an ecological approach to the planet to a white light, dissociative ego death experience.
But who's to say what is real spirituality and what is fake spirituality?
Well, exactly right. So that distinction between a real and a ersatz experience, I don't really adopt. And the difference between a medicine and a sacrament, I think, again, these are integrating nicely over time. Other questions? Sir?
Yeah, there was one at the end. How do we educate the general public as to the use of psychedelics? Because there's so many different strands. We're talking about religion, medicinal. What would be the best tactic you would use to educate the general public who are suspicious because of the narrative that they've been fed continually?
I can't give you a specific policy response, but the general response is information, knowledge freely available.
Through what channels? Through the media? Just through your own policy research?
Yeah. If the information is freely available, then it's freely available through all channels. And so I can only answer in that way. I think that information, education through the schools, it's very important to teach people how to take drugs because that teaches you how not to take drugs. You need to understand the positive benefits of all sorts of drugs, like heroin, which has been demonized, is quite useful in end-stage cancer, more useful than the other drugs that are available. So there's a use for every drug, I believe, and there's contraindications for every drug as well. Like I said, a history of schizophrenia in your family is a contraindication for these wonderful substances that this whole conference is about. So that kind of information, I believe that if people are given proper information, they will, over time, make the right decision. Sir?
You said that it's therapy for the soul. So my question is, how are you going to measure that? Have you got some new measures? Are you going to use traditional medical measures? Or have you got some better psychedelic measures of success?
Well, I think the measures of clinical outcome, of happiness, of the way your life is running, what your marriage is like, what your work is like, if you're an alcoholic, different things like that, outcome measures for any therapy are appropriate for this sort of therapy as well. Another question?
Last one, I think.
Last question then, sir?
You mentioned that we're redoing research from the 50s and 60s. How long will it be, how long will it take for the current process of randomized controlled trials to transform itself into wider?
That's a really great question too, and I'm glad to end on it because I believe that we're moving toward a rescheduling of these substances, in particular psilocybin, in large part because of Roland's work and the work of the Hefter Research Institute that supports a lot of the similar research on using psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety. That's a wonderful application area. The data are coming in strongly, and then there's MDMA through post-traumatic stress disorder and other areas too. The ibogaine research is moving apace as well. So I think within, shall I go out on a limb? Within 5 years or 5 or 10 years, there'll be rescheduling of some of these substances. And then there's the process of more research in clinical practice. And the continuing process. I think, as I said before, that psychedelics both require a change in society but also facilitate it. So the more research that's done, the more it's accepted by the medical community. The more it's rescheduled and accepted in common practice, the more society will change. The more receptive society will be to more research and more usage. So for me, it's kind of like a leapfrogging approach that's really a beautiful race as to which drug will be rescheduled first. So I've been asked to stop. I thank you very much for listening.